while Bush's network was securing the skies, a young Bill Clinton was cementing his position on the ground. Clinton suddenly rose to power very quickly in Arkansas politics. He was Attorney General in 77, and by 79, he was governor. At 32 years old, he was one of the youngest governors in United States history. He didn't come from money. He had no skull and bones to speak of, no fraternity. He didn't have an oil empire. He had no deep state pedigree whatsoever, unlike his future business associates and partners in crime. If Bush was the architect of a covert empire, Clinton was his apprentice. But his first term flopped. In 1980, Clinton lost re-election. Obviously, I'm talking about governor. He took the loss very personally and very seriously. Clinton rebranded. He softened his image. He started courting the right people. And in 1982, he ran again, and he never lost after that. Welcome to Far Out with Faust, everybody. I am Faust Checho, and I am excited to be back once again, bringing you episode 2 of the Bush-Clinton crime family extravaganza we are putting on for you. In episode 1, if you have not seen it, I recommend you press pause and go back and watch that. It's a quick and compelling view, and you'll be totally filled in and ready to go on this episode if you do that. But as usual, we have a ton of information to get through. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into it. My question, my friends, is what if America's so-called war on drugs was never actually a war at all? What if it was a business model? And what if the same men who claimed to be fighting it, the ones who declared the war on it, were the ones running it? That's a secret that most people are completely oblivious to in the United States. Maybe they know in other countries, but certainly it's not common knowledge here. I was never taught that, and I grew up during the war on drugs. In episode 1, we covered how former President and Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush, a pre-selected prince of the American parasite class, quietly built an empire through covert power, plausible deniability, and a shadow war in Vietnam. And that war had a lot less to do with communism or democracy, and a lot more to do with heroin than anyone has ever taught you in school. And we introduced his future understudy, his partner in crime, no pun intended, my friends, Bill Clinton, a.k.a. Slick Willie, a charismatic, abused Southern boy turned quasi-Rhodes Scholar who somehow ended up protesting the Vietnam War from inside the Soviet Union. Not suspicious at all. 2 men, 2 paths, 1 empire. And now the map expands. Let's flash back to Washington, D.C., 1976. And I want to introduce you to the time when cocaine took over our economy. If you can just picture this, and if you're watching the video on Rumble or YouTube or Patreon, then you probably have a visual. A seasoned political insider steps in front of the cameras. The new director of the CIA is sworn in. His name was George Herbert Walker Bush. He smiles. He's calm as a cucumber. Psychopath. Press flash bulbs are going off and everyone's getting his picture. In his own autobiography, he would later call the appointment a real shocker. We'll return to that. Because officially, Bush had never worked in intelligence before. But unofficially, that's a different story, okay? Because behind the scenes, the CIA was already shifting its global drug operations from the jungles of Southeast Asia and the Golden Triangle to the mountains of Colombia. You see, the war came to an end and the heroin pipeline dried up. But something new was taking shape. Faster, purer, more profitable, easier to refine. Cocaine. Cocaine's a hell of a drug. The war on drugs was about to begin, but it's not the war you were told about. Let me remind you what we learned in episode 1 really quickly. The Bushes came up through the Skull and Bones, and the Skull and Bones was a secret society at Yale that essentially was sponsored for, bought, and paid for, like most of Yale and the land that it's on, by the Russell Trust Company. The Russell Trust Company is the crime family that has relations across United States presidents who are responsible for the opium trade, were responsible for the opium trade in England and around the world at that time. So they had a massive tutorial in how to use drugs to make a fortune. The Bushes did, because they were right there, part and parcel with the Tafts, with the Russell family, at Skull and Bones. Okay, so the blueprint existed, and they were waiting for the opportunity to seize on it. And Bush's next move to pick up where we left off in episode 1 was, in fact, a war for control of the drug market. And he was very, very good at it. You see, when the U.S. pulled out of Vietnam in 1975, it didn't just lose the war, it lost a giant smuggling route. The Golden Triangle, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, that was the heroin capital of the world. And Air America, that was the CIA's covert airline, in case you didn't know, helped flood the West with product under the fog of war. I'm going to repeat that. It was the CIA and these covert operations using their airlines. They are the ones that flooded our streets, our country, and the West with products that they were getting from Vietnam and the Golden Triangle. Okay? Again, I don't remember learning that in school when they taught us about Vietnam. I think that said something about communists and fighting for democracy and the freedom of those peoples. Something absurd like that. So, the war ended. The pipeline collapsed, and the agency needed a new frontier because they were not about to give up their revenue streams, which were in the billions. Enter Latin America. As I mentioned, cocaine was cheaper to grow, it was easier to refine, and it was 10 times as profitable as opium. It was a literal no-brainer for them to make this transition. And the men who built the heroin empire in Southeast Asia, they didn't retire and go quietly into the night. They were reassigned, essentially. Bush, recently tapped as the CIA director, assembled what insiders would later term his dream team. I'm not talking about politicians. I'm not talking about paper pushers. I'm talking about operators, agents, people on the ground. These men were extremely efficient. They didn't just know how to move drugs and guns and money. They knew how to disappear the evidence and the people who might thwart that operation. Let's meet the roster, shall we? Theodore Shackley. Why does his name sound familiar? Oh, yeah. Go back and watch episode 1, and you'll see a clip where a lieutenant is talking about a meeting that he had with Kun Sa, who was running the Golden Triangle in Vietnam. And in that meeting, Kun Sa told this soldier the truth, that Theodore Shackley and George Bush were his biggest customers. So who was Theodore Shackley, a.k.a. the Blonde Ghost? The spy master behind the Phoenix program in Vietnam and the architect of black ops so dark that even Congress couldn't trace them. Next up, Thomas Clines, the bagman who turned covert logistics into an art form, moving weapons, cash, and silence across continents. And then there's Richard Secord, the airlift general, who could build a covert airline overnight and disappear a shipment before anyone knew it existed. Next up, Felix Rodriguez. Does that name sound familiar? Because if you've done any research into the JFK assassination or the war on drugs or Iran-Contra or any of the scandals that rocked this nation and would go on to define the politics and the government in D.C. as the decades approach the millennium, you've heard of Felix Rodriguez, the Cuban exile warrior, a Bay of Pigs veteran turned counterinsurgency pit bull. If the U.S. needed dirty work in Latin America, Felix was a go-to. And then there's Donald Gregg, the quiet conciliere, a career CIA operative who became Bush's closest national security advisor, a man who never spoke out of turn and never forgot a name. As we saw with Bush's mysterious CIA roots, secrecy was the real currency here. These were not random hires, my friends. This was an all-star team. They were the core architects of America's covert drug-fueled empire. And when the job called for even deeper cover, they brought in outside help. Foreign assets, shadow contractors, foreign agents, and some say even Mossad operatives. Some like me say that because there is ample evidence, which I'll show you. Maybe we won't get to it in this episode, but certainly episodes 3 and 4. And these were in place to help keep the pipeline secure, off the books and out of the headlines. And they were willing to do whatever it took in order to accomplish that. As we will continue to unfurl in all these episodes, you will see the depth of depravity that these people went through to keep their secret and keep the money flowing. The infrastructure was already in place, my friends. They had black sites, they had airstrips, they had offshore accounts, and they had discrete banks that they could launder through. All of this was in place from Vietnam. And they had gotten really good at it, diverting money to the Nazis way back then, as we covered in episode 1. Again, if you have not seen that, pause this and go and watch it so you know where we are. Now, by 1980, Bush had jumped from CIA director to Reagan's running mate. It wasn't really a mystery how that happened. It was insurance. Reagan was the outsider. Bush was establishment. He was a deep state diplomat. He was their freaking poster boy. He was a company man. Okay? And when Reagan won, Bush brought the empire in with him. We must get into, if you've been listening at all to Trump talk, and I don't really watch reality TV, so I don't watch a lot of his speeches, but I did watch, I think, the inauguration one, and of course he's talking about the cartels and how he's going to declare them terrorists and we're going to go after them. And I was like, but why doesn't he tell everyone that we're responsible for them, that we created them, that we helped orchestrate them, that we put them in place, that we allowed them to flourish? Why doesn't he mention that? Since it's extremely relevant, and most people don't know it. The Medellín machine, cocaine cartels, and covert cooperation. Let's get into it, okay? The true power behind the drug trade wasn't always who you saw on the news, and that statement continues to be true to this day. If you binge watched Narcos, you got the romance. But here's the part that they left out. The Medellín Cartel didn't just survive, it flourished because it was extremely useful. Not in spite of U.S. intelligence, not because it found a way through the persecution of U.S. intelligence, but because of U.S. intelligence. And the cost? Entire nations destabilized, families shattered, generations lost to violence, addiction, and corruption still going on to this day. I cannot stress to you enough the catastrophic suffering that has been put into play because of greed, because of these three-letter agencies, and because of families like the two I'm talking about. And for what? To feed a black market empire engineered by the same agencies that launched this so-called war on drugs. What many people don't know, my friends, is that the cocaine story doesn't start in Colombia. It actually starts in Bolivia and Peru, where the cocoa plant has been grown for centuries. You see, for generations, the indigenous population, and this is still true to this day, chewed cocoa leaves to survive at high altitudes. Not just to survive, but it was a medical remedy. It was used for a little bit of energy. It was used for headaches. It still is to this day. But in the 1970s, something changed. The U.S. market exploded, and so did demand. Cocoa crops expanded. Entire valleys in Bolivia were converted into production zones, and a new class of criminal chemists began turning leaves into cocoa paste, which is the raw material for cocaine. And then came the cocaine coup of 1980. What was the cocaine coup again? I'll tell you. The cocaine coup, say that fast, 5 times, really fast. The cocaine coup was when a military junta seized power in Bolivia with the help of drug money and foreign operatives. Wait a minute. Is that the only time that's happened? One of the architects of this coup was Klaus Barbie. That doesn't sound like a South American name. Well, that's because he wasn't South American. He was the infamous Nazi war criminal, also known as the Butcher of Lyon. After World War II, Barbie was smuggled out of Europe by who? The United States, of course, Operation Paperclip, and Vatican-backed rat lines, and he resettled in Bolivia. And what did he do? He began advising military regimes and intelligence cutouts on everything atrocious. His post-war alias was Klaus Altman. His specialty? Torture, counterinsurgency, and now apparently narcotics. You see, from behind the scenes, it was Barbie who helped install the very regime that industrialized cocaine production in Bolivia. Why? Because Bolivia wasn't the end of the operation, it was the beginning. It was the rise of the Medellín Cartel. Medellín is in Colombia. It was in Medellín that the paste was transformed into powder, and a new kind of empire was born. And this wasn't just a drug ring, my friends. This was a vertically integrated multinational. I mean, it was a black market General Motors. It was a massive machine. Pablo Escobar, he became the face of it all. You know, he was flashy, he was charismatic, and he learned to be brutal if he wasn't always. He built soccer fields and hospitals while running hit squads and bombing airplanes. You know, he was a narco-populist who became a global icon. But Pablo didn't build the machine alone. He had a crew, each one very critical to the empire's rise. Let's talk about his crew, shall we? There was Carlos Leiter. Sounds familiar. Again, doesn't sound like a South American name. That's because he was half German and half Colombian. And he was fully unhinged. He was a fanatical admirer of Hitler and aviation. He took cocaine logistics to another level, my friends. He bought Norman's Cay. That's an island in the Bahamas. And he turned it into a fortified smuggling hub. Private airstrip, radar jamming equipment, armed guards, you name it. From Norman's Cay, Leiter's fleet could hit Miami in 45 minutes with multiple deliveries a day. He wasn't just a trafficker. He was the pioneer of airborne cocaine smuggling, a man who viewed logistics as a form of conquest, obsessed with it. Next on our list is Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, Gacha, a.k.a. El Mexicano. He was nicknamed for his obsession with Mexican narco culture. Isn't it crazy how, like Saddam Hussein, his favorite movies were The Godfather, and like our media inspires the most ruthless, brutal, evil people on the face of the planet. Go Hollywood. So glad I don't take part in that industry anymore. So, Jose brought with him militarized violence to the cartel. He trained camps. He trained hitmen for them. He had alliances with paramilitary death squads. He moved like a general, and he struck like a warlord. Well, his role? Enforcement, intimidation, elimination. If Escobar was the king, Gacha was his shadow army. And last but not least, the Ochoa brothers, Jorge, Fabio, and Juan David. The Ochoa brothers didn't have Escobar's charisma or Gacha's bloodlust, but what they had was stability and connections. They had landowners in their pockets with deep ties to Colombia's elite, and they helped the cartel launder money by politicians and legitimize their operations. They were not the face of the cartel. In fact, you probably never heard of them, but they were its foundation. Make no mistake about it. So by 1984, very special year, the Medellín Cartel controlled 80% of the world's cocaine trade. They didn't just move drugs, they moved systems. They bought airstrips, pilots, judges, radar towers, bankers, senators, you name it, they bought it or killed it if it didn't cooperate. They had accountants on Wall Street, they had assassins on mopeds, and while the DEA waged its media war on drugs, the real war was something else entirely. The cartel's secret weapon? Protection. Despite the arrests, despite the seizures, despite the headlines, the cartel kept growing. I want to show you one of the key ways they did that.
But, here's an interesting thing. You're only using if for the benefit of those who are uninformed about what's going on. If the CIA has actually been involved in smuggling drugs into the United States, as I know for the last 45 years they've been doing, how do you keep all these people quiet? Because it takes a lot of people. Well, the way we keep them quiet is working with the Justice Department, and anybody that threatens to expose any of this, we simply charge them with offense. Either we fabricate the charges or simply charge them for doing what we ordered them to do. And they end up in federal prison. Usually federal judges will cooperate, as I describe in my books, where federal judges will not let them bring in any of the CIA witnesses or won't let them produce the CIA, the documents showing that they were CIA. and they end up in prison. And this, I mean, there's hundreds of people that this has happened to.
Yeah. One of the most common tactics used, my friends, of course, is that they let the little guy take the fall, or they let their operatives take the fall, and they hang them out to dry. And of course, they do it through the courts. They do it through prosecution. They literally accuse them of what they were paying them to do. It's a very simple process. They've already been committing crimes. They don't have to prove anything. They just decide, instead of aiding them and keeping them out of the public's eye and law enforcement's eye, what they do is charge them for what they've been paying them to do. It's literally the most corrupt system imaginable. So that I just wanted to give you a little taste of, how people are like, oh, how could they possibly get away with it? But if you own the courts and you have the power, what do you mean? What's hard to imagine? And behind all this chaos, my friends, a bigger game was being played. According to former DEA agent Mike Levine, in his book, The Big White Lie, the CIA itself helped create La Corporación. Did I say that kind of French? Sorry. A secret partnership of drug traffickers and intelligence operatives. And he called it, guess what? The General Motors of cocaine. Why? Because the profits weren't just building mansions, my friends. They were funding proxy wars, black ops, and off-the-books intelligence operations entirely. This wasn't about any rogue agents. This was policy. Understand, this was policy. The real war wasn't on drugs. It was for control of them. Remember that. And we're going to see that just like Vietnam, really nothing to do with communism or democracy, this was about cocaine. And why they still needed Mena, Arkansas, which we're getting to, my friends. We're getting to. I'm laying the tracks so that we can take the train all the way up into Arkansas, being oversaw and run by Bill Clinton through his partner in crime, George Herbert Walker Bush. So they needed Mena because these operations were expanding so big, and they found a ready-made player who's willing to throw his hat in the game for his love of money, cocaine, and other things. Bill Clinton. Okay, so we're getting to Mena. All right. By 1983, the Caribbean corridor was collapsing. Okay, the Bahamian government, under U.S. pressure, raided Norman's Cay. Carlos' leader fled. The air routes were compromised from then, and the cartel needed something new. They needed longer range and higher payloads. They needed more expansion. They needed places they could trust and people who didn't ask too many questions, okay? They needed pilots with serious credentials and, even more serious, connections. And that's exactly what they found. And whom? And they were looking for it where? Well, they found it at a quiet airstrip tucked into the forests of western Arkansas. And from there, everything would change. Most of you have heard of Barry Seal. I don't know if you've ever saw the movie American Made, but Tom Cruise played the part of Barry Seal. It's probably one of the most well-known drug smuggler pilots that came out of this era, right? So we have to talk about him because he was the ghost in the skies. Before the cartel deals, the covert ops, and the fatal loose ends, Adler Berryman, a.k.a. Barry Seal, was just a kid from Baton Rouge who loved to fly. At 16, he took his first solo flight, and by 26, he was flying 707s for TWA. The dude was a prodigy in the cockpit, all right? He had a daredevil streak and a habit of pushing limits that caught the CIA's attention. He was a prime candidate. So he was working and flying and having fun, and then something happened in the late 60s. You see, he left the TWA under suspicious circumstances, shall we say, and rumors swirled about a CIA-linked Cuban exile op gone sideways. And that's where the official story ends, and the legend of Barry Seal begins. Some say that legend stretches back even further, including his own wife's claim that Barry flew a getaway plane out of Dallas the day JFK was killed. Now, why would she say that? She did not like or appreciate anything Barry had gotten involved in. She knew it would be the death of him, and it was. And so if she said that, it's because he told her he did. Why would he fly a plane out of Dallas, a getaway plane out of Dallas on the day JFK was shot? I'll leave that for you to ponder. And who else just happened to be secretly in Dallas that day? Let me remind you. Oh, that's right. George Herbert Walker Bush, a.k.a. Poppy Bush. That's an interesting twist. I wonder if there's a connection. So Barry started showing up in places he wasn't supposed to be. You know, he was flying strange cargo with even stranger routes. You think Barry Seal was the first to fly contraband for the CIA? Try Laos. Try Air America. It goes back a little further than that. But by the early 80s, Seal's flights were getting heavier and stranger. He was moving serious weight. But who was he moving it for? This part was always murky, okay? His life was wild, man. I mean, like I said, Tom Cruise played him in the movie American Made. But the real story, of course, is much stranger. The truth is always stranger than fiction, my friends. Even as his name popped up in DEA and FBI files, nobody could touch him. Nobody. And the movie makes that clear, much to Bill and Hillary's chagrin. Seal was the subject of multiple federal investigations by the DEA, the FBI, the IRS, U.S. Customs, state police of every kind in both Louisiana and Arkansas. Constantly under investigation, constantly being watched. But he seemed to have a get-out-of-jail-free card. No pun intended. How did he manage it? Well, according to Max Mermelstein, a Medellín insider turned government witness, quote, nobody talks to nobody. Each agency guarded its intel like gold. No one shared, which meant nobody saw the full picture, and Barry was able to keep flying. Even Seal's own wife had no idea he was smuggling drugs for the longest time. She thought he was working covertly for the U.S. government. Timothy McVeigh, Lee Harvey Oswald. Does any of this sound like a familiar pattern, a familiar story? And that's what he told her he was doing before he became officially a DEA informant in 1984. Oh, so now he's going to be protected. He's officially a DEA agent, right? When she was eventually questioned by investigators, her testimony reflected this belief of hers. Was Barry bluffing, or was he running a long con? Was he playing both sides? Or had he been working for someone else all along? Someone even higher up on the food chain? The handoff. Okay, from Reeves to El Gordo. I'll explain. Barry Seal became the cartel's golden goose. The runs were handled by William Roger Reeves. And this was a self-proclaimed smuggling legend, but he was important, so we have to mention him. He flew for Escobar. He survived 5 prison breaks, torture, shootouts. I mean, in his own words, he said, I'm an adventurous person. That's putting it mildly. Reeves employed Barry on several jobs, but by 1984, Barry was ready to graduate. He reached out to the cartel under an alias and arranged a meeting in Miami. This was his first test as a direct liaison. The Ochoa brothers did not know his real name. They called him El Gordo, the fat man. But Seal passed this test, and they gave him an audience with none other than Pablo Escobar himself in Medellín. And that's when Seal learned about a new opportunity. A renovated airstrip and hangar in Nicaragua, quietly offered up by the Sandinistas. Or at least that's what he was told. Treachery. The message came through a man named Federico Vaughn, who claimed to be a senior aide to Nicaragua's interior minister. But Vaughn's background was murky, man. No diplomatic credentials, no paper trail, no confirmation from the Sandinistas. Was he a trafficker? I mean, was he a government liaison? Or was he something else entirely? Vaughn is going to resurface again, I can assure you. And when he does, the stakes are going to be far higher than a simple airstrip. So, according to House subcommittee testimony that we have on record, Barry flew some Ochoa men to Mena, Arkansas, to inspect his aircraft. And once they gave the thumbs up, he flew to Colombia and he met with Carlos Leader, another cartel kingpin I mentioned earlier. They loaded the plane with 1,500 kilos. But the runway was a muddy mess, okay? Seal hesitated because he didn't want to die and crash. The cartel didn't. Okay, they were very persuasive. Barry ended up crash landing. Okay, but the cargo run wasn't canceled. It was just postponed. All right, on the second attempt, they made it to Nicaragua. Managua, Nicaragua. But someone forgot to grease the political wheels there, my friends, because the plane was fired on by the Nicaraguan military, and Barry spent the night in a Sandinista jail. Somehow he made it out of that jail too. It's very, very difficult to hold in a jail, Mr. Barry Seal. So Barry told Escobar, we're going to need a bigger plane. Escobar's response, hold my beer. He flew back to Mena, Arkansas to go shopping. And for those of you who are read into this and who know some of the history, that is how Barry Seal ended up with the legendary C-123K military transport plane. That was a Vietnam-era beast of a bird. It was retrofitted for one purpose and one purpose only, to carry as much weight as possible. They called her the Fat Lady, and she would become the centerpiece of one of the most controversial covert operations in the United States history. Because somewhere along the line, this operation stopped being just about cocaine. It became an arms for drugs exchange backed by intelligence handlers with military-grade logistics. And it was a pipeline that needed political cover on both ends to continue to thrive. So, turns out that cash and drugs weren't his only cargo, but we're going to get into that next episode. Okay, so the supply chain was nearly complete, if I've painted this picture well enough. The planes were ready, the routes were mapped. Now they just needed a governor in a state in America who was down for this and cool with it, and in fact would be willing to stick his neck on the chopping block in order to make sure this does not get interrupted and nobody gets in trouble. And right on cue, Bill Clinton's rise to governor in Arkansas began. Thank you for your patience in waiting for the skinny on Slick Willie. It has arrived, my friends. So while Bush's network was securing the skies, a young Bill Clinton was cementing his position on the ground. You see, after his return from Oxford and the whole Rhodes Scholar thing, which, by the way, he never completed. I don't know why it says he's a Rhodes Scholar on his Wikipedia page. And then he had that mysterious detour to Moscow. Clinton suddenly rose to power very quickly in Arkansas politics. He was Attorney General in 1977, and by 1979, he was governor. At 32 years old, he was one of the youngest governors in United States history. But he wasn't born into this like some of the characters we're talking about. He didn't come from money. He had no skull and bones to speak of, no fraternity. He didn't have an oil empire. He had no deep state pedigree whatsoever, unlike his future business associates and partners in crime. Back in episode 1, we asked whether Clinton was being vetted and tested for his loyalty. Well, let's consider the results, shall we? If Bush was the architect of a covert empire, Clinton was his apprentice. But his first term flopped. Voters said he pushed too hard, too fast. In 1980, Clinton lost re-election. Obviously, I'm talking about governor. He took the loss very personally and very seriously. Clinton rebranded. He softened his image. He started courting the right people. And in 1982, he ran again, and he never lost after that. And just like Bush, Clinton had his dream team of cronies. Betsy Wright, she wasn't just a staffer, she was Clinton's personal fixer. And he had a lot of them, and he needed a lot of them, and he would need more as his political career aged. My God, he would need more. Betsy Wright controlled access. She managed scandals. She cleaned up messes before they reached the press. If Clinton was the candidate, Wright was the firewall. And then, of course, we would be remiss if we didn't touch on the well, I don't want to say better half because she's certainly not better. But let's do Hillary Clinton, the Rose Law Firm. This was more than just a law office. This was the nucleus of Clinton's power base and the source of two key players, okay? And you have to go back to episode 1 and watch about ADFA and see the clips from the Clinton Chronicles and understand what the Rose Law Firm was doing and for how long and for how much money they were bringing in and the amount of cocaine that was being smuggled in is just unfathomable, okay? The Rose Law Firm, it became Clinton's power base and source for two key players. One was Webb Hubbell. This was a big old hawking lawyer of a man with deep political connections. And then there was Vince Foster, a trusted confidant and legal brain. Names that would haunt the Clintons for decades, and for good reason. And you're going to hear those names again in our coming episodes, so try and remember them. Then, of course, there was Dan Lassiter. Remember, you may remember him from episode 1. Okay, he was a wealthy bond dealer. He was a party kingpin. No wonder him and Bill got along so good. And he was a longtime ally of Clinton. This dude didn't just bankroll campaigns, he bankrolled lifestyles. He hired Roger Clinton as a chauffeur. You know, Bill's brother, the one who did time for drugs, cocaine. My God. But the relationship ran a lot deeper than just, employer. Parties, cocaine, connections, okay? And eventually, state-sponsored finance. When Clinton created remember the acronym, ADFA, Arkansas Development Finance Authority, Lassiter's firm was suddenly handling lucrative, tax-free bond deals, rubber-stamped by the state. Now, officially, it was designed to boost the state's economy through tax-free bonds. What a joke. Unofficially, it was a slush fund. It was personally overseen by Bill Clinton via the Rose Law Firm. It was a political favor machine with a banking license, and the governor held the keys. And he was using those keys for a wide variety of things. You know what I'm saying? In summary, real quick, 2 minutes, get you up to speed.
Bill Clinton sold the concept of ADFA to the people of Arkansas as a vehicle for creating jobs and assisting churches and schools. In reality, millions of taxpayer-guaranteed dollars were being channeled to Clinton's election campaigns, to his inner circle of friends, and to his wife Hillary's law firm. This may explain why ADFA had been drafted in such a manner as to keep its decision-making procedures secret.
If you needed $1 million, you had to get your application handled by the Rose Law Firm, pay them $50,000. There were 5 other companies in the state of Arkansas that were actually more qualified in bond structuring and applications, but Rose Law Firm got them all. I started checking around and I kept asking, well, one thing's bothering me to the comptroller, Bill Wilson, how do people make payments on these loans? He looked at me and said, they don't. He thought I knew. Well, that blew my mind. And this is about 2 months in, and it was getting tough then. So I started gathering the documents. After everybody left, I would stick around as if I were working on the annual report. That would give me access to all the documents, and I make copies of them all. For about 2 months, I watched accounts accumulate money. At the end of the month, they zero balanced. They're laundering drug money. There were $100 million a month in cocaine coming in and out of Mena, Arkansas. They had a problem. They were doing so much money in cocaine, $100 million. You create a problem in a little state like Arkansas. How do you clean $100 million a month? ADFA until 1989 never banked in Arkansas. What they would do is they would ship the money down to Florida, a bank in Florida, which later would be connected to BCCI. They would ship money to a bank in Atlanta, Georgia, which, by the way, was later connected to BCCI. They'd ship to Citicorp in New York, which would send the money overseas. And there was an interesting one, a bank in Chicago. That bank, by the way, is partially owned by Dan Rostenkowski. Dan Lassiter would get the bonds. He would become the broker for the bonds. He would transfer money back to ADFA. He never sold a bond. The money then would leave ADFA, go into one of the various banks for the specific bond loan, and they would zero it out. When they zeroed it out, they were giving it back to Lester, less their handling fees.
Wow. Yeah, I just thought In 2 minutes, you get a very good idea. And we'll talk about who was speaking there. That poor guy who spoke out. Yeah. So, as I mentioned, loans were approved in secret. Oversight was minimal. Money was flowing. And no one was allowed to ask where it was going. And while the Bond boys were getting rich, so was the Chicken King. Don Tyson. Remember, does that name sound? Does Tyson, you've seen that name in a supermarket, right? So let's talk about Don Tyson. He was head of Arkansas's largest employer. And he wasn't just selling poultry, okay? He was buying influence. He donated very generously to Bill. He lobbied for regulatory favors, and according to FBI files that never led to prosecution, he may have even been connected to the cocaine trafficking and public corruption. Nothing stuck, of course. Don Tyson being a billionaire and from the oligarch parasite class families. Usually things don't stick when you try and press charges against those guys because they're in charge of the people doing the prosecuting. Anyway, let's do a quick summary, shall we? Don Tyson and his relationship with Bill. Let me give you a little overview real quick. And so you know how involved Bill was.
How could this happen? How does someone elude prosecution with reams of investigative reports? How does it get stopped? Some say it's Bill Clinton.
Don Tyson was in the middle of the cocaine just like Bill Clinton, just like Dan Lester, just like Roger Clinton, and all the others. So you see, all of this incest, and all of this drug running, all of the trafficking of drugs, sending them all over the nation, came out of Little Mena, Arkansas, right under the nose of little Governor Billy Clinton. I went to Bill, and I said, Bill, you've got 2 weeks to tell the truth, or I'm going to tell it. You're breaking the law, and I can't be a part of it. You made a mistake. I'm not one of your buds, or at least I'm not that big a buddy.
When Larry Nichols made his disclosures, made them public, the Clinton spin doctors treated him unmercifully. It shocked those of us who had been kept in the dark through the years in Arkansas politics. The Arkansas news media had done little, if anything, to uncover anything derogatory about Bill Clinton. And for these disclosures to come out of the blue was so shocking that the spin doctors attacked the messenger rather than tried to answer the charges that Nichols had made. And they did such an efficient job that it caused me and others to look with less than favor on Larry Nichols as an individual.
Although the documented information contained in the Clinton Chronicles continues to be reported in England and other countries, here in America, the media blackout continues. On July 14th, 1994, copies of the Clinton Chronicles video were hand-delivered to every member of the United States Senate and House of Representatives. On July 25th, documentation supporting the film was presented to Congress at their request. Whitewater hearings were scheduled to begin the next morning. However, the then House and Senate majority leaders, plotting with Robert Fisk to withhold evidence, refused to allow any of this documentation to be admitted. In addition, eyewitnesses willing to testify under oath who could confirm Clinton's involvement in the Arkansas drug smuggling money laundering operation were flown into Washington, but were barred from giving any testimony. Once again, the Constitution of the United States was undermined and the American people were not allowed access to the truth. That same day, a massive media smear campaign was launched against the Clinton Chronicles. Time magazine, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, and major newspapers around the nation simultaneously published false information about the video in an attempt to diminish its distribution.
Wow, does that sound like familiar tactics to anyone else? It sure does to me. They're using the same exact playbook so that you shoot the messenger. So, Don Tyson, a billionaire involved. There will be more billionaires involved before these episodes are out. Okay, so Bush had his covert networks abroad, and Clinton was building his own right here at home. Okay, One of the insiders, Larry Nichols, saw it firsthand. Okay, Larry worked at ADFA until '88 when he was abruptly fired for making hundreds of calls to contra-connected groups in Central America. And at the time, it looked like some kind of bizarre HR scandal. But later, Nichols claimed it wasn't a mistake. It was standard operating procedure. You see, ADFA was laundering money, and Clinton knew it. Most people called him a crank, but even broken clocks are right twice a day. So as you're going to see in upcoming episodes, Nichols wasn't the only one sounding the alarm, because something was happening in Arkansas, and it wasn't just about politics. It was about logistics. It was about protection. It was about partnership, and it became Murder, Inc. The trafficking operation at this point was nearly complete. The money was moving. The planes were flying. All that was left was to make sure nobody looked too close. And Bill, well, he didn't just look the other way. He was the way. So by the mid-1980s, Mena, Arkansas had become a hub of quiet chaos. Barry Seal was flying in product and flying out weapons. The DEA, the FBI, the IRS, local sheriffs, they were all watching. They could all see what was going on, and everybody knew something stunk. But what can they do about it? What could they do about it? Nobody seemed to be able to stop it. I wonder why. Every time a case got traction, it vanished. Witnesses disappeared. Reports were buried, like the infamous Boys on the Tracks. We're going to get there in episode 4. I have a whole lot of information. Boys on the Tracks were about the two teenage boys, 13-year-old boys, who went out hunting one evening and never came home because they stumbled upon and saw these planes. This would become a nationwide scandal. This would bring all of this to the forefront, at least for 15 minutes anyway. And of course, then the media did everything it could to contain it and put out damage control and destroy the credibility of the people making the claims. But through it all, one man sat at the top of the Arkansas pyramid, and that was Bill Clinton. When asked about Mena, he claimed to know nothing. And even if he did, he said it wasn't a state matter. It was the Fed's responsibility. Right. Oh, and who was the top of the federal government at the time? Oh, yeah, it was George Herbert Walker Bush holding down the fort after some unknown nut tried to shoot Reagan. Oh, that's right. Some unknown nut. We'll show you how connected that unknown nut is to the Bushes in our next episode. John Hinckley, the Hinckleys, longtime Bush family friends. Make sure you tune in to our next episode. We're going to get into the details of that, and you're going to see how just unbelievable these connections are, how blatant, how belligerent, and how arrogant they are to imagine that the truth would never come out. Okay, but make no mistake, all right? Bush wasn't just a ceremonial VP at the time. Even with Reagan infirmed, he wasn't cutting ribbons and kissing babies, all right? Insiders say he was running foreign policy and overseeing national security and managing all the covert operations. He's probably one of the last sitting presidents to do that on the scale that he did. This is the same man who once run the CIA, and now he had his hands in Reagan's black ops machines and a direct line to Langley. If Arkansas was the hub, Bush was the air traffic controller, okay? And yet Clinton claimed he didn't know. This is so ludicrous. Do you understand? Of course, he knew. He had to sign off on everything. So it's not about Barry Seal. It's not about smuggling, and it's not even about cash, right? It's about this global, interconnected criminal syndicate that has its hands in everything. And that, as I always say, puppets the people in politics because they're easily owned and captured. So I discovered a great man. His name is Chip Tatum. Now, I don't know if he's a great man, but I do know that he's crafty and found a way to survive becoming a true whistleblower. Chip Tatum, fascinating individual. He was a former Vietnam Green Beret turned CIA covert op who blew the whistle on what was happening here and so much more. And so I want to give you just a little taste of the mind-blowing interview. Like I've seen so much footage, and this is him with former FBI insider and truth teller Ted Gunderson, also a true patriot and hero. And so when people make the claim that Clinton didn't know, and like it's, you just laugh at them. Okay, stand by.
Chip, let's go back, and we've talked about Ollie North, we've talked about George Bush, we talked a little bit about Clinton. Do you have any direct knowledge that Clinton was aware of the drug operation coming into Arkansas?
The direct knowledge is that Buddy Young was actually a advisor to Clinton. He was his chief of security, and he was one on board the aircraft, and he was sent there by Clinton to investigate the loss of monies that had been determined. Additional direct knowledge comes in the fact that one of the people called by Barr was the governor of Arkansas on that SATCOM. He called North, he called the vice president on this 24th of March conversation, and he called the governor of Arkansas and talked to him. So, and governor of Arkansas then was William Jefferson Clinton. So they were talking about the enterprise, about the lost monies. And additionally, in earlier years, and when I was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, I actually flew several missions carrying medical coolers again with money and drugs in it into Arkansas.
Out of where, Fort Campbell?
Out of Fort Campbell. It was delivered to us by the 324th Med Battalion.
Out of the South America?
Out of South America. They were operating in the South America in Honduras. It was flown by C-130 to Fort Campbell. It was marked medical supplies. Donor organs, this particular one was marked. And we were advised to give it to Dr. Lassiter at Little Rock Air Force Base. So we flew it to Little Rock Air Force Base. I opened the coolers. I don't fly a cooler without opening it. I don't fly anything without opening it. Let me tell you why I don't fly coolers without opening them. I was told by Colby earlier that Torrijos died simply because they put a cooler marked donor organs on his aircraft that blew up in flight. So whenever I see a cooler, I open that cooler.
And what did you find in the cooler?
We found a large sum of money and 3 kilos of cocaine in one cooler. In the other cooler, we found all cocaine. Those 2 coolers were picked up by Dr. Lassiter, who actually ended up being, as we found out in later years, a man named Dan Lassiter, who was convicted for trafficking cocaine in Arkansas. However, he was pardoned by the then governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton.
And did you have any information that Clinton had direct knowledge of that? No, you flew him into Arkansas. Was Clinton there waiting for it, or was there a limousine there or anything like that?
We had to wait over an hour and a half for Dr. Lassiter to show up. But when he finally showed up, he showed up in an entourage of vehicles. There was a van, there was a stretch limo, and an unmarked police car. In the coming out of the stretch limo, Dr. Lassiter came forward. He had 2 people with him. One stayed at the car and one came over. He introduced the one that walked over to the aircraft to pick up the coolers as the governor of Arkansas. And the governor of Arkansas extended his hand, and that's the first time I shook the hand of William Jefferson Clinton.
Yeah, he didn't know. No, he didn't know anything. Really? I mean, are there people that believe that still? Seriously? My God. Didn't know anything. Come on. Anyway, let's get back to it. So as we mentioned, Clinton didn't come from old money, all right? He was not connected the way the Bushes were, all right? He didn't have the skull and bones ties. You know, the best you could make a claim was that he had low-level mob ties due to a mother who had a gambling problem, okay? But even that is going to be hearsay. So Billy had to earn his seat the hard way, right? He was smart and he was charming and he played the game really well. But when you're not born into power, there's always one more test, right? There's always one more compromising position that you have to get into in order to prove that you can be part of the club. Because whether it's the mob or the machine, loyalty doesn't come cheap. And these days, the machine and the mob are interchangeable and, you know, virtually indistinguishable. So how do you prove that you won't blow the whistle? How do you prove that you won't squeal if the shit hits the fan? Well, Sometimes you have to hang your own family out to dry, as Bill did when it came to Roger. The feds came for Roger. You see, that was Bill's younger brother. He was very loud, loved the party even more than Bill, and he was deep into the Arkansas, let's say, party scene. He was arrested for possession and intent to distribute cocaine. Now, to the public, it looked like a personal embarrassment. You know, a politician's troubled sibling caught in a bad lifestyle, but nothing that a good PR firm can't get ahead of, you know? It seemed to me like a loyalty test. You know, would Bill step in and pull strings and save his brother? He let Roger take the fall. And of course, not long after that, national power began to swing wide open for him. I'm sure he eventually got his brother out of jail. He got everyone else out of jail. Maybe he didn't like his brother. I don't know. But in this world, nothing builds trust like silence, and nothing proves loyalty like sacrifice. So now the shadow war begins, from cocaine to Contras, okay? By the mid-1980s, the puzzle pieces were all in place. You had a smuggling empire set up in Arkansas. You had a cocaine colossus set up in Colombia. You had a VP with black ops credentials, unlike most and in the previous decades, running point in Washington. But what tied it all together? That's the question. That the story that almost no one truly understands, because just as the U.S. drug war was heating up at home, a very different kind of war was being waged abroad. And most Americans never heard about that war. It was in the back channels of Washington. It was in the jungles of Nicaragua, and it was in the corridors of Langley. It was a covert campaign, and it was already underway. The official excuse for it? To stop the spread of communism in Central America. But if you've been paying attention, you know by now that that's a joke. That is not the story. That's just the cover. Planes were moving. Money was moving. Everything was flying. What started in Vietnam grew in Colombia and landed in Arkansas, and it was about to explode in national headlines. The only problem, most of the story never made it in the news. Why? Because we know who controls the news. We know what mainstream media is about. We've all had a very hard lesson in it over the past 5 years. Talking heads, parroting what the government and their three-letter agencies want you to believe and understand. In episode 3, we are going to dig into the scandal that rocked the Bush-Reagan White House. And we're going to talk about the secrets that didn't make it out of Langley. All right? Iran-Contra wasn't a rogue operation. It was a policy. And it changed everything. 2 wars, 2 fronts, 1 machine. And that machine did not care who got crushed underneath it. We're going to get into it all in our next episode. The boys on the tracks, Iran-Contra. We're going to wrap up Barry Seal. We're going to get into Chip Tatum, because this is a dude who, just like Barry Seal, has some... And like when you learn about the dead man's trigger that Chip Tatum had and how he survived, you are, I mean, one of the craftiest ideas for survival I've ever heard. And he's still alive to this day, God bless him. But so much more to come, my friends. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode. If you liked it, please, if you're listening on Spotify, comment, write us a review, give us 5 stars on iTunes. If you're listening on YouTube and you haven't subscribed, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. If you want to support me and this incredible community that we're building, we have a Patreon page where all of our uncensored material lives. And we also have some incredible tiers for you guys. We make personal merchandise with the Far Out with Faust logo, and we have all kinds of really cool perks on there. If you want to support me, please go to Patreon. And we usually get into topics that YouTube won't allow, and we need our Patreon page in order to host that section of my podcast and the conversations. But if you like this episode, by God, please let me know in the comments. And don't forget to check out episode 1 and stay tuned for episode 3 and 4. It is coming, my friends. God bless you. I love you. Stay safe. And thank you for watching.